Maybeck approached the bat enclosure from the Mahajaj Jungle Trek path. The enclosure was quite large, with colorful prayer flags strung between the facade of a fake building, rock walls, and the large box-like frame that supported a wall and roof of mesh netting. A three-stage viewing room had been built along the path. A ranger would be on duty once the park opened at 9 a.m., but for now it stood empty. Maybeck avoided the viewing room just in case, staying outside, moving along the perimeter wall of the netting. He left the path and entered the jungle, keeping close to the enclosure's netted wall. It was only then he saw the birds. His first reaction was of astonishment. He thought it beautiful in a way, 1,000 or more dark birds so crowded into the treetops that large branches bent under their weight. He thought how fortunate he was to see such a phenomenon, that it probably only happened in the early hours before guests arrived, and scared away all but the most brazen of wild creatures that had adopted the animal kingdom as their home. Then he noticed something strange about the birds. They all seemed to be looking right at him. He knew this was impossible, and yet the thrill of astonishment gave way to the electrical jangle of raw nerves. They were looking right at him. Two things happened then. He spotted a door into the enclosure about 10 yards further into the jungle, and the first of the birds left their perches and flew toward him. He knew he shouldn't panic. It was only birds after all. But the way they surrounded him, the way the jungle went suddenly silent, the way the bats in the enclosure awakened with the start of nocturnal animals, a restless chittering as they hung from their perches sent a spike of terror through him. Birds flew in flocks, certainly, but they didn't attack as a group, did they? The birds attacked. It was as if someone had blotted out the sun. They came at him as a dark cloud of beating wings and unflinching black eyes. Their small bird legs were aimed right at Maybeck. The birds came at him in such numbers that at first it was just plain scary. They landed on his head, his shoulders, his arms, his back. But then it went beyond scary to dangerous, as the weight of them pushed him down. To an outside eye, it would have appeared as if 1,000 birds had landed in the same spot of the jungle at once. But to Maybeck, it meant a pitch-black flurry of wings and beaks and scratching claws. He fought them off one-handed, grabbing, poking, sweeping his arm, and knocking the birds away. But back they came. He knew he could not sustain the weight of the birds, the pecking. Now crushed by the heaviness, feeling it might break him in two, Maybeck released the pillowcase to defend himself. A tiny hand reached out. A monkey hand. It snatched up the pillowcase and the monkey took off running. As it did, the birds flew off. In a flutter of feathers, the sun reappeared, and Maybeck watched as the monkey, pillowcase in hand, hurried down the path. He looked himself over as he ran, not a scratch on him. If he were to tell anyone what happened here, they wouldn't believe him. He had no proof whatsoever. 1,000 birds attacked me. It would sound like a lame excuse for having lost the pillowcase and the captive bat. He had originally thought Finn's claim that the bat might be maleficent was a bit of a stretch. But now he reconsidered. Birds didn't organize themselves like that, he reminded himself. Monkeys were known thieves, but what was a monkey doing loose inside the animal kingdom, even if the park was not yet officially open? He had questions that needed answering. He ran as fast as he could. When the monkey stole off into the jungle, Maybeck followed. Willa crossed Discovery Island, feeling as if everyone were staring at her. Could they tell she was underage? She didn't think she looked all that much younger than the other girls. The formality of the uniform helped her look older, adding a good 3 or 4 years to her 14. But what if they were staring because they recognized her face as that of a DHI? If caught, she could lose her family's gold pass as well as her performance contract. She might no longer be one of the kingdom keepers. She kept her head down and wished she would use more makeup at the costume warehouse. The ID badge Wayne had given her was clipped to her waist. helping to make her look official. With her eyes to the ground, she walked with her back straight and took determined strides. Knowing the importance of body language, she had volunteered for what was possibly the most dangerous assignment that Philby and Finn had come up with: to infiltrate and search the Kilimanjaro safari grounds. The idea was a simple one. If someone was holding Jez in Animal Kingdom, why not stash her in a place where people were prohibited from going? When the park was open, the safari teemed with hundreds of wild animals. People riding on the safari were restricted to the backs of safari trucks with a driver guide who pointed out animals and took guests on a mission to save a baby elephant from make-believe poachers. But according to Philby's research, throughout the safari grounds were feeding stations, waypoints, and even some hidden gates offering backstage access. The Overtakers had once hidden Maybeck in a maintenance cage inside Space Mountain. It seemed possible, logical even, that they might hide Jez in a similarly impossible to access place. But if one of them got there before the animals were released...
It's done in stages. Thompson's gazelles are pretty tame and harmless. Some aren't even up and around at night, but most of the other animals are. They're fed and washed and doctored, if need be, after the park closes to the public.
But what about early morning?
Before the park opens, they return the animals in a specific order that offers the fewest problems. The trick for you is to get inside before 8 a.m.
Willa didn't wear a watch. She had no idea what time it was. That was an oversight. She was guessing it was between 6:30 and 7 a.m., which gave her about an hour. But the later it was, the less time she had. She quickened her steps, off Discovery Island now, and headed toward the entrance to the Kilimanjaro safari. A tremendous flock of black birds passed overhead. There must have been thousands of them. They streaked across the morning sky and were gone.
If you hurry, you can catch the last one.
She looked up. It was a cute guy wearing a uniform identical to her own. He stood below the sign for the Kilimanjaro safari.
Yeah.
Willa tensed as she felt his eyes following her. Did she look old enough to carry an ID badge? She walked quickly through the empty waiting area, turning and winding her way down to the loading dock, where one of the trucks was waiting. There was an older woman. She had been nearly 30, leaning forward from the front bench coaching the driver. Willa was the only passenger besides the instructor. It was obviously some kind of training run. The truck rumbled off down a path that wound through the jungle.
I'll be hopping off at Uturi Forest.
The instructor, without so much as looking back, lifted her arm and waved. Willa heaved a sigh of relief and held on as the driver avoided puddles and recited some memorized lines into the radio, communicating with other rangers who were searching for the poachers. Willa had taken the safari ride many times and enjoyed the story behind it as well as the animal watching. But the emptiness of the place at this hour gave her the shivers. The truck rounded a bend and slowed.
Is here all right?
It's fine.
The Uturi forest, Willa realized. She hopped the 3 feet down to the muddy ground, hoping the instructor wouldn't see that she was wearing running shoes and not the required ranger boots. She slapped the side of the truck and it lumbered off. The minute it was gone, she regretted getting off. Alone on the truck route, in the midst of a thick forest of bamboo and sea cane, Willa spotted a pure white ibis as still as a statue. The bird stood on one leg, perfectly balanced. She unfolded the map Philby had given her, tried to establish her position, and punched through the forest to her left, expecting to come across a feed station within the next 30 yards. It was tough going, the forest thick with vegetation. As she looked behind her, she would have seen a lizard following. It was 5 or 6 feet long, with a thin tail and little claws on its feet. Not so much a lizard, more like a Chinese dragon. Maybeck lost ground to the small agile simian that moved throughout the jungle's tight growth in a seamless, fluid motion. He wondered if the monkey was under Maleficent's control, but if so, then why had it been ordered to not release the bat? His answer came as a slice of first light caught his eyes. Bats were nocturnal. It was sunrise. Releasing the bat was not an option. Maybeck had to get it back. He smashed into bamboo and rubber trees, baby banyans and mangrove. He sloshed through the flooded jungle floor, quickly gaining on the monkey. Maybeck's progress registered on the monkey's face as wide-eyed terror. It shrieked and exploded into a frenzy, briefly increasing its lead on Maybeck, but only briefly. Maybeck broke out of the jungle and felt something hard beneath his feet. He looked down. Train tracks. The Wildlife Express train was going through its morning test run. Maybeck jumped out of the way when he heard a blast from the train's whistle.
You crazy?
The conductor shouted through the open window. He'd been spotted. As the train passed, he saw the conductor reaching for his radio. Not good. The train whistle pierced the morning air, sending a flock of sandhill cranes into the blue sky. Maybeck spotted the monkey. It had been crouched in the center of the birds. He closed the distance to 10 yards, then 5. The train had followed a long, sweeping curve of track, but was now coming around and catching up to them. It appeared to Maybeck's right. The monkey changed directions, going straight for the train. Maybeck skidded to a stop, caught a toe, and went down hard. He looked up to see a monkey slip beneath a train car, the pillowcase in hand. Maybeck hurried to his feet and ran toward the train. The train conductor hung out of the locomotive, shouting at him. Maybeck squatted in time to see a monkey racing across the short distance of grass toward more jungle. There was no way Maybeck was about to crawl under a moving train. He waited it out impatiently. It seemed to move very slowly. Finally, Maybeck took off toward the end of the train and came around it, once again crossing the tracks. He found himself next to the Chakandri chicken shop. He came to a halting stop, looked left, right. There, a flash of white pillowcase was all he caught just rounding a bend in the path. He took off, heading away from flights of wonder. Again, his size and speed overcame the monkey's efforts. The monkey sensed its pursuer and skittered back and forth in a zigzag, chattering loudly. It crossed the path and shot straight up a dangling rope toward a concrete tower. It reached the turret, nearly 30 feet off the ground, and briefly disappeared. The next time Maybeck saw it, the monkey, still carrying the pillowcase, hurried across a set of ropes toward a crumbling Asian temple encased in bamboo scaffolding. This was on an island surrounded by a narrow moat. Maybeck stopped at the concrete tower. The end of the rope the monkey had climbed was frayed as if it had been chewed through. He studied the layout, noticing that the rope bridges connected to the temple, which meant the monkey weren't supposed to be able to get down off the towers. The moat was meant to prevent their escape from the island, but the monkey had managed to drop a rope that had yet to be spotted. By doing so, they had given themselves an escape route. The monkey disappeared into a red brick temple, dragging the pillowcase behind it, and was gone. Maybeck, understanding the importance of acting quickly, rolled up his pant legs, pulled off his shoes, and waded into the murky water. A pair of ducks startled and splashed away to the other side of the temple, squawking and quacking. Maybeck felt the cold mud ooze between his toes. Bubbles rose to the surface all around him, giving off an unpleasant odor. He faced a wooden door with iron bars over its small square window. It was the only way into the temple that he could see. He arrived there in 5 giant steps and, sloshing out of the water, reached for the door's handle. Willa checked Philby's map once more. He had marked the location of a feeding station disguised as a large stump at the end of the savannah. Its proximity to a nighttime animal holding pen qualified it as a possible hiding place where Jez could be kept and never discovered. A clock ran off the seconds and minutes in her head. She had several such places to check before the animals were released. She pushed through the forest, following the map, and reached the edge of the sprawling savannah. A flat plain of low grasses interspersed with trees and rocks and a few small ponds. All of it surrounded by low, rolling hills. It glistened in the first golden rays of dawn. There, quite some distance away, she saw a stump, thinking immediately that it couldn't possibly be Philby's stump because it looked so real. The location was right, so she decided to have a look. There was a problem. There was no way to sneak up toward a stump in the middle of the field without being seen. She had to cross 100 yards in the open. Not that there was anyone to see her, but another training truck could come by at any minute. She decided rather than run out and look suspicious, she would casually walk just another day on the job. Hopefully the ranger uniform would do the rest. Then taking in her surroundings, she happened to look back. At first, she thought it was an alligator. Terror gripped her. Alligators ate people. It happened all the time in Florida. She heard they could run faster than humans, and when you saw one, you didn't want to run because it teased them into chasing you, and if they chased you, they considered you food. So she continued walking, though slightly faster than before. The stump or fake stump rose at least 3 feet off the ground, if she could only reach it in time. But then she looked again. It wasn't an alligator after all, but a giant lizard, maybe 6 feet long. She studied Komodo dragons in school and they pretty much looked exactly like one. Komodos didn't eat people, but they were known to bite and do some serious harm. She didn't know the rule about Komodos. Do you walk or run? The lizard turned sideways for a sec, as if to size her up, and once again she changed her mind. It wasn't a Komodo. It looked more prehistoric, with thick scales, and was that possible? Wings tucked along its back. It looked more like a dragon. She read stories about dragons, had seen movies. She always considered them mythological creatures. But now she was looking at one. It had a disgusting pink tongue that flickered like a snake's, but about 2 feet long. The tongue curled as it drew back between the rows of gray, stubby teeth. She wanted to think of this as a coincidence. The two of them had just happened to cross paths, and now it was following her. Tracking her was more to the point, she thought. But then something even more strained entered her thoughts. What if Jez was indeed locked up in the stump, the food locker, and the dragon was some kind of patrol for the overtakers? After all, the safari was filled with all sorts of animals, from giraffes to zebras. But a scaly Asian dragon with wings? The overtakers. If Jez was being kept out here on the savannah, it seemed obvious who would guard her. And if there was a dragon mixed in with the rest of the animals, could that possibly be a coincidence since dragons hadn't existed for the past few million years, if ever? So what exactly was the dragon waiting for? It just lingered back there, a dozen yards away, trolling back and forth across the grassy landscape as if sniffing around for food. If he was going to attack her, why not get to it? Could a dragon possibly think? Could it be it was waiting to see if she would head for the stump? She subtly increased both quickness and length of her strides. She glanced back to see the dragon had stayed right with her. It didn't seem to be moving any faster either, and yet there it was. Now more convinced than ever that she was its intended target, she looked around and realized she was all alone out in the savannah. She saw an ostrich in the distance. Perhaps they had begun releasing the animals already. A herd of Thomason's gazelles shot across the field, but some nights they were left on the grounds. It didn't mean much to see them. If on the other hand the animals were already being released and introduced to the savannah, then Willa hoped they might distract the dragon from its current obsession with her. She moved increasingly closer to the stump, and now looking back, she saw the dragon following her. If she climbed on top of the stump, she would be out of the reach of the dragon. But what about the wings? Could something like that possibly fly? She heard the sudden beating of hooves. Second later, mixing with the rumble of a truck engine, a herd of zebras had been released, again to her left, and from somewhere behind her was a truck approaching. If she was going to inspect the stump, it had to be now. She ran the last few yards, and if she'd harbored any doubts as to the dragon's intention, they were answered by its light-footed sprint to keep up with her. There was no turning back now, no changing her mind. The dragon raced toward her, its mouth open, snapping at the air. She reached the side of the stump. Though shaped like a stump, it was made of metal with a small door in its side. She worked the snap lock off the hasp and opened the door. The dragon charged, seemingly not touching the ground at all. It flicked its long tail back and forth, moving in a snake-like fashion, quickly closing the distance between them. Willa dove inside and pulled the door shut behind her. It was incredibly warm inside. Enough light filtered that it allowed her to see that Jez was not there. There were sacks of food and salt licks. It smelled like a pet store. A coiled hose hung from a hook. The dragon smashed into the door and then slammed its powerful tail against the stump. Her ears rang. A rumbling in the ground grew louder. Willa looked out the crack in the access door to see the herd of zebras bearing down on her as it crossed the savannah. The dragon took off for a distant tree and climbed its creepy, effortless way. And then she saw it. Freshly scraped into the fake stump's rusty metal was a simple message that absolutely made no sense, and yet somehow she knew it had been written by Jez. It read, "Change Rob." She curled up and held her breath, waiting to flee the stump once the storm of zebras had passed.